The winter of 1816 descended upon London like a velvet glove adorned with diamonds, deceptively beautiful yet suffocatingly tight around the throat of high society. Within the marble corridors of Mayfair mansions, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows against silk-papered walls, the aristocracy moved through their prescribed rituals with the precision of clockwork figures in an elaborate music box. Lady Vesper Montclair stood before the floor-length mirror in her dressing chamber, her ladies maid fastening the intricate mother-of-pearl buttons that lined the back of her emerald silk gown. At 32 years of age, Lady Vesper possessed a beauty that had evolved beyond the fresh bloom of youth into something far more dangerous, the calculated allure of a woman who understood precisely how to wield her charm as both sword and shield. Her auburn hair was arranged in the latest fashion, with delicate ringlets framing her face, while the majority was swept into an elegant chignon adorned with emerald pins that matched her eyes. "The pearls or the diamonds tonight, my lady?" inquired her maid, presenting two jewelry cases lined with midnight blue velvet. "The pearls, Margaret. Tonight calls for the appearance of innocence," Lady Vesper replied, her voice carrying the melodious cadence that had made her the most sought-after conversationalist in London drawing-rooms. Yet beneath the honey-sweet tones lay something sharper, more calculating. Though we both know appearances can be terribly deceiving. The pearls that encircled her slender throat had belonged to her late mother, the Duchess of Harrington, and carried with them not just monetary value but the weight of 3 generations of noble blood. Each luminous sphere seemed to capture and reflect the candlelight, creating an almost ethereal glow around Lady Vesper's décolletage. The necklace was complemented by matching pearl drops that caught the light with every subtle movement of her head, and delicate pearl bracelets that adorned her wrists like chains of moonlight. Lady Vesper's townhouse on Berkeley Square represented the pinnacle of Georgian architectural elegance. The drawing-room where she now descended was a masterpiece of interior design, with walls covered in hand-painted Chinese silk depicting scenes of exotic birds and flowering branches. Furniture crafted by the finest cabinetmakers of the era filled the space, a mahogany settee upholstered in cream brocade, matching armchairs positioned strategically for intimate conversation, and a writing desk of such exquisite craftsmanship that visiting dignitaries often inquired about its provenance. The morning ritual of receiving callers had become Lady Vesper's domain of power. Between the hours of 11 and 1 in the afternoon, a steady stream of London's most influential ladies would arrive in their elaborate carriages, each hoping to glean some morsel of information that might prove useful in their own social machinations. The sound of horses' hooves on cobblestones and the gentle chiming of the doorbell created a symphony of social commerce that played out daily in drawing-rooms across Mayfair. "Lady Pemberton has arrived, my lady," announced Hartwell, the impeccably dressed butler whose discretion had made him invaluable to Lady Vesper's operations. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his black tailcoat pressed to mathematical precision, and his white gloves spotless despite having just assisted with the morning correspondence. Lady Catherine Pemberton swept into the drawing-room like a ship in full sail, her burgundy velvet pelisse trimmed with ermine creating an impressive silhouette. At 55, she maintained the bearing of a woman accustomed to deference, though the fine lines around her eyes spoke of countless nights spent worrying about the social standing of her 3 unmarried daughters. Her bonnet, adorned with ostrich feathers and silk ribbons, was the latest fashion from Paris, despite the ongoing tensions with France. "My dear Vesper," Lady Pemberton exclaimed, settling herself upon the brocade settee with the careful grace required by her tightly laced corset. "You simply must tell me about the arrangements for the Winterbourne Ball tomorrow evening. I have heard whispers that it is to be the grandest affair of the season." Lady Vesper poured tea from a Wedgwood service painted with delicate roses, the ritual providing her with a moment to consider her response. The china clinked softly against itself, a sound as refined and controlled as the woman who wielded it. "The Duke of Winterbourne has spared no expense, I am told. 3 orchestras have been engaged, and the ballroom has been transformed into a winter wonderland with thousands of white roses and crystal ornaments imported from Vienna." "And the guest list?" Lady Pemberton leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow managed to remain perfectly audible. "Naturally, all the finest families will be in attendance. The Duke has extended invitations to over 300 of London's most distinguished residents." Lady Vesper's smile held secrets like a locked jewelry box holds treasures, including some rather interesting recent additions to our social circle. The mention of new faces in their carefully curated world caused Lady Pemberton's eyebrows to rise with the precision of theatre curtains. In the rigid hierarchy of London society, newcomers were viewed with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, particularly when they possessed the wealth necessary to secure invitations to the season's most exclusive events. "I trust you are referring to the Ashford family? The Earl who recently inherited his title under such mysterious circumstances." Lady Pemberton's fan fluttered with nervous energy, creating small currents of air that carried the scent of her lavender powder. "Among others," Lady Vesper replied, allowing the phrase to hang in the air like incense. "Though I confess, I find myself more intrigued by certain established families who may find tomorrow evening rather more eventful than they anticipate." The clock on the mantelpiece, a magnificent piece crafted by the renowned clockmaker John Harrison, chimed the half-hour with notes that seemed to underscore the weight of unspoken implications. Lady Vesper's eyes drifted to her escritoire, where beneath a stack of social correspondence lay a single letter that had arrived that morning via private messenger. The parchment was of the finest quality, the wax seal bearing the crest of one of England's oldest noble houses, but it was the contents rather than the presentation that had caused Lady Vesper's pulse to quicken when she first broke it open. "My dear Catherine," Lady Vesper said, rising gracefully and moving to the window that overlooked Berkeley Square, "I do believe tomorrow evening's festivities will provide conversation material for months to come. The winter season has been rather quiet thus far, has it not? Perhaps it is time for spring to arrive early." The view from the window revealed a world of ordered beauty, carriages moving with stately precision along the cobblestone streets, footmen in livery attending to their duties with clockwork regularity, and gentlemen in their tall hats and perfectly tailored coats conducting business with the gravity befitting their station. Yet beneath this surface of civilized perfection, Lady Vesper knew, lay currents of passion, ambition, and secrets that could destroy reputations with the efficiency of Greek fire. Lady Pemberton departed with promises to share any intelligence she might gather before the ball, leaving Lady Vesper alone with her thoughts and the letter that seemed to pulse with dangerous potential from its hiding place. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows cast geometric patterns across the Persian carpet, creating an intricate maze of light and shadow that seemed to mirror the complex web of relationships that defined their world. As evening approached, Lady Vesper dismissed her servants and retreated to her private study, a smaller room lined with leather-bound volumes and illuminated by a collection of silver candelabras. Here, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations, she carefully withdrew the letter and spread it upon her mahogany desk. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the words formed by a hand trembling with either passion or desperation. The contents revealed a story of forbidden desire that had blossomed in the shadows of respectability, of stolen moments in conservatories and secret correspondence conducted through trusted intermediaries. But most shocking of all was the identity of the participants in this dangerous liaison. The Countess of Ravenshollow, a woman whose reputation for virtue had been beyond reproach for nearly 30 years of marriage, and her own son-in-law, the young and devastatingly handsome Marquis of Thornfield. The Countess of Ravenshollow, born Lady Evangeline Fairfax 47 years prior, had married into one of England's most prestigious titles at the tender age of 18. Her wedding to the Earl of Ravenshollow had been celebrated as the social event of its season, uniting two ancient bloodlines and considerable fortunes in a match that appeared blessed by both heaven and practical considerations. The Earl, 15 years her senior, had been a kind if distant husband, more devoted to his extensive library and archaeological pursuits than to the passionate attentions of his young bride. For nearly 3 decades, Lady Evangeline had fulfilled her role with the dedication of a master actress playing her greatest part. She had presided over elaborate dinner parties where politicians discussed matters of state over multiple courses prepared by French chefs. She had hosted charity events that raised thousands of pounds for worthy causes, while simultaneously providing opportunities for the finest families to display their largesse. She had accompanied her husband to court functions, garden parties, and race meetings, always impeccably dressed, always graciously charming, always the perfect embodiment of noble womanhood. Her appearance remained striking despite the passing years. Tall and elegant, With silver-threaded dark hair that she wore in sophisticated arrangements suited to her station, Lady Evangeline possessed the kind of beauty that deepened rather than faded with age. Her wardrobe consisted of gowns in rich jewel tones that complemented her still luminous complexion, while her jewelry collection included pieces that had adorned countesses of Ravenshollow for 2 centuries. The Ravenshollow estate in Hertfordshire sprawled across 3,000 acres of perfectly maintained parkland, with a manor house that had been expanded and refined by successive generations into a monument of architectural achievement. The library where the Earl spent most of his time contained over 10,000 volumes, while the portrait gallery displayed 200 years of family history in oil and canvas. It was within these halls that Lady Evangeline had raised her daughter Lucinda, preparing her for a marriage that would continue the family tradition of advantageous alliances. Lady Lucinda Ravenshollow had inherited her mother's beauty but possessed a temperament more suited to country life than the rigid protocols of London society. At 22, she preferred long walks through the estate's gardens to hours spent in drawing rooms, and found greater pleasure in reading novels than in the elaborate needlework that occupied most ladies of her station. Her marriage to the Marquis of Thornfield had been arranged with the same careful consideration that had characterized her mother's union, bringing together 2 families whose combined influence could shape the political landscape of the nation. The Marquis of Thornfield, Lord Adrian Whitmore, had accepted the match with the resigned duty that his upbringing had taught him to value above personal inclination. At 28, he possessed the classical handsomeness that made him the subject of whispered conversations among unmarried ladies throughout London society. His dark hair, worn in the fashionable style that required daily attention from his valet, framed features that might have been carved by a Renaissance sculptor. His eyes, a striking shade of deep blue, seemed to hold depths that promised either great passion or profound melancholy. Adrian's education at Eton and Oxford had prepared him for his eventual inheritance of one of England's premier dukedoms, but it had not prepared him for the suffocating predictability of his prescribed existence. His days followed patterns established by generations of his predecessors. Morning rides through Hyde Park, afternoon sessions in the House of Lords, evening social obligations that extended far into the night. The marriage to Lady Lucinda had been another item checked off the list of duties required by his station. The Thornfield mansion on Grosvenor Square stood as a testament to accumulated wealth and refined taste. Its facade of pale Portland stone rose 4 stories above street level, with windows arranged in perfect symmetry and adorned with wrought iron balconies crafted by master metalworkers. The interior spaces reflected the latest in fashionable decoration, walls covered in silk from Lyon, furniture by the most celebrated cabinet makers, and artwork collected during grand tours of the continent. It was during one of the elaborate dinner parties hosted jointly by the Ravenshollow and Thornfield families that the first spark of forbidden attraction had ignited between Lady Evangeline and her son-in-law. The evening had been designed to celebrate the first anniversary of Adrian and Lucinda's marriage, with 40 of London's most distinguished guests gathered around tables set with Sèvres porcelain and Georgian silver that reflected the light of hundreds of candles. Lady Evangeline had been seated across from Adrian, as propriety demanded, but their conversation had ranged far beyond the safe topics usually discussed at such gatherings. They discovered a shared appreciation for poetry, particularly the works of Lord Byron, whose scandalous reputation only added to the appeal of his verse. Adrian's eyes had lingered on Lady Evangeline's face as she quoted passages with a passion that her usually composed demeanor rarely revealed. "You surprise me, Lady Evangeline," Adrian had said during a lull in the general conversation, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I had not expected to find such depth of feeling beneath your perfect composure." "Perhaps, my lord, you have been looking only at surfaces," she had replied, her fan moving with studied casualness while her eyes held his with an intensity that made the candlelit room seem suddenly charged with electricity. That moment of connection had been followed by others, carefully orchestrated encounters that maintained the appearance of coincidence while serving deeper purposes. Adrian began attending Lady Evangeline's weekly salon, where discussions of literature and philosophy provided cover for exchanges of increasingly personal nature. Lady Evangeline found reasons to call upon her daughter at the Thornfield mansion, visits that somehow always seemed to coincide with Adrian's presence in his study. The transformation of maternal affection and filial respect into something far more dangerous had occurred with the inevitability of seasons changing. What began as meaningful glances across crowded ballrooms evolved into brief touches of hands during formal dances, then progressed to stolen moments in conservatories where exotic plants provided screens for conversations that grew more intimate with each clandestine meeting. Lady Lucinda, absorbed in her own world of domestic contentment and blissfully unaware of the undercurrents flowing around her, continued to regard her mother as the perfect model of noble virtue and her husband as the dutiful partner their families had chosen for her. Her days were filled with the pleasant routines of managing their household, corresponding with friends, and preparing for the social season that would soon require their presence at countless engagements. The letter that had found its way to Lady Vesper's morning correspondence had been penned during one of those stolen afternoons when passion had overwhelmed prudence. Lady Evangeline, her usual careful control abandoned in a moment of desperate longing, had committed to paper words that should never have been written, sentiments that could destroy not merely her own reputation but the stability of two of England's most prominent families. "My dearest Adrian," the letter began, the handwriting growing less controlled as the emotions poured forth, "the hours we spent in the rose garden yesterday have haunted my thoughts through the endless night. When you took my hand and spoke of the love that dare not be acknowledged, I felt my heart break and soar simultaneously. How cruel that fate should bring us together only to decree that we must remain apart, bound by chains of duty and propriety that grow heavier with each passing day." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing not only the depth of their mutual attraction but specific moments of intimacy that had occurred during their secret meetings. It referenced locations within both family estates, times when the Earl and Lady Lucinda were occupied elsewhere, and most damaging of all, plans for future assignations that demonstrated a complete abandonment of the moral principles that were supposed to govern aristocratic behavior. The final paragraph contained the most explosive revelations. "Tomorrow evening at the Winterbourne Ball, when all of London society is gathered under one roof, I shall wear the sapphire necklace that you admired so greatly. When you see it gleaming at my throat, know that I am thinking only of you, regardless of who may be watching. After the final waltz, I shall retire to the blue salon on the 3rd floor. If your heart calls to mine as strongly as mine calls to yours, you will find a way to join me there. Consequences be damned." How this incendiary document had come to be intercepted and delivered to Lady Vesper remained a mystery that would soon prove far less important than the use to which she intended to put it. As she sat in her candlelit study, reading and rereading the words that could topple kingdoms of reputation, Lady Vesper felt the familiar thrill that came with possessing information of such devastating potential. The clock struck 10 in the evening, its chimes echoing through the quiet townhouse like a countdown to the social apocalypse that tomorrow's ball would surely witness. Lady Vesper carefully folded the letter and locked it away in her private safe, but not before making several copies on paper that bore no identifying watermarks. The game of social chess that had entertained her for years was about to reach its most spectacular conclusion. The Winterbourne mansion rose from its 10-acre grounds like a monument to the accumulated power and refined taste of one of England's oldest ducal families. Its neoclassical facade, designed by Robert Adam himself during the height of his architectural fame, presented a symphony of proportion and elegance that had inspired countless imitations throughout the fashionable districts of London. Columns of perfect Corinthian order supported a pediment carved with allegorical figures representing the seasons, while windows arranged in mathematical precision looked out over gardens that had been landscaped by Capability Brown to resemble scenes from idealized pastoral paintings. As the afternoon of the ball progressed, an army of servants moved through the mansion's rooms with choreographed efficiency, transforming already magnificent spaces into a wonderland worthy of imperial courts. The grand ballroom, which occupied the entire east wing of the mansion's piano nobile, had been decorated according to a winter theme that bordered on the fantastical. Thousands of white roses, shipped at enormous expense from the heated conservatories of Holland, created cascades of blooms that seemed to flow like frozen waterfalls from pedestals positioned throughout the room. Crystal ornaments imported from the finest workshops of Venice and Vienna caught and reflected the light of 6 massive chandeliers, each containing over 200 candles that would transform the space into a glittering cavern of light. The parquet floor, inlaid with precious woods and patterns that told the story of the Winterbourne family's heraldic achievements, had been polished to mirror brightness and scattered with rose petals that released delicate fragrance with every step. Lady Vesper arrived at the mansion precisely at 8:30 in the evening, timing her entrance to coincide with the height of the arrival period when the maximum number of guests would witness her dramatic appearance. Her carriage, a masterpiece of vehicle craftsmanship painted in deep blue with gold trim and drawn by matched grey horses, drew admiring glances from the crowds gathered to watch the procession of London's elite. She had chosen her ensemble for this evening with the same strategic consideration that generals applied to planning military campaigns. Her gown, created by the most celebrated modiste in London, was a masterwork of midnight blue silk that seemed to capture and hold starlight in its folds. The bodice, cut in the height of current fashion, was adorned with intricate beadwork that caught the light with every breath, while the skirt fell in perfect lines that emphasized her elegant figure without compromising the essential modesty required by her station. Her jewelry for the evening consisted of diamonds that had belonged to her grandmother, a parure that included a necklace, earrings, and bracelet of such exceptional quality that they were rumored to have once adorned Marie Antoinette herself. The stones seemed to generate their own internal fire, casting rainbow patterns across her décolletage and drawing the attention of every person she passed. Lady Vesper Montclair, announced the liveried footman stationed at the ballroom entrance, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled company despite the underlying hum of conversation and music. The sound of her name caused a subtle shift in the room's energy, conversations pausing briefly as heads turned to observe her entrance. She moved through the receiving line with practiced grace, exchanging the prescribed courtesies with the Duke and Duchess of Winterbourne while her eyes catalogued the faces of those already present. The cream of London society had indeed gathered under the crystal chandeliers. Cabinet ministers and their wives mingled with successful merchants who had purchased their way into respectability, while military officers in dress uniforms added splashes of scarlet and gold to the predominantly dark formal wear of the gentlemen. "My dear Vesper," exclaimed the Duchess of Winterbourne, a woman whose own reputation for intelligence was matched only by her skill at managing the complex social dynamics of the ton. "How absolutely radiant you look this evening. I do hope you will find our modest entertainment worthy of your attention." "Your Grace, modest is hardly the word I would choose to describe this magnificent spectacle," Lady Vesper replied, gesturing with her fan toward the transformed ballroom. "I confess myself quite overwhelmed by the beauty you have created here." As the exchange of pleasantries concluded, Lady Vesper accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman and began her circuit of the ballroom, greeting acquaintances and filing away observations that would prove useful in the evening's entertainment. Her trained eye noted which ladies had chosen to wear their finest jewels, which gentlemen appeared nervous despite their outward composure, and most importantly, which members of the Ravenshollow and Thornfield families were present and how they were positioned within the social geography of the gathering. Lady Evangeline, the Countess of Ravenshollow, had arrived shortly before Lady Vesper and was currently engaged in conversation with a group of parliamentary wives near the orchestra platform. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that complemented her still striking appearance, but it was her necklace that drew Lady Vesper's particular attention. The sapphire and diamond parure was indeed magnificent, with stones the size of robins' eggs set in mountings that had clearly been crafted by the finest jewelers in London. Each sapphire seemed to hold depths of midnight blue that reflected the candlelight like captured starlight. The Marquis of Thornfield stood with a group of younger gentlemen near the card-room entrance, his formal attire immaculate and his bearing carrying the unconscious authority that came with his elevated station. Lady Vesper noticed, however, that his attention seemed divided, his eyes frequently straying across the ballroom to where his mother-in-law held court among her contemporaries. Even from a distance, the tension in his posture was evident to anyone trained to read the subtle signs of emotional distress. Lady Lucinda, the young Marchioness, appeared blissfully unaware of any undercurrents as she danced a country dance with Lord Pemberton's eldest son. Her gown of pale pink silk trimmed with silver lace suited her youthful complexion, and her genuine smile as she moved through the figures of the dance created a picture of innocent happiness that would make the evening's revelations all the more shocking. The Earl of Ravenshollow had positioned himself in the library adjoining the ballroom, where several distinguished gentlemen were engaged in discussions of politics and philosophy that provided refuge from the social obligations of dancing and small talk. His presence there, rather than beside his wife, was noted by several observers, though none yet understood its significance. As the evening progressed through its carefully orchestrated phases, Lady Vesper maintained her position as a charming and engaged guest while privately preparing for her moment of dramatic revelation. She had concealed the copied letter within her reticule, a small beaded bag that matched her gown and would never be suspected of containing such explosive material. The first waltz of the evening was announced by the orchestra leader, a piece by Strauss that had become fashionable in London's most exclusive circles. Lady Vesper observed with interest as the Marquis of Thornfield approached his mother-in-law and requested the honor of a dance, a perfectly proper gesture that drew no comment from other guests. As they moved onto the floor and took their positions among the other couples, Lady Vesper noted the careful distance they maintained, the precise adherence to proper form that spoke of practiced self-control. Yet even the most casual observer might have noticed something in the way their eyes met during the turns of the dance. Intensity of connection that exceeded the polite attention expected between family members. When the music required them to draw closer during certain figures, the tension between them became almost palpable, creating an atmosphere of suppressed electricity that seemed to charge the air around them. "They dance beautifully together," commented Lady Pemberton, who had appeared at Lady Vesper's elbow with the stealth of a practiced social observer. "Such grace, such perfect timing. One might almost think they had been partners for years rather than family members united by marriage." "Indeed," Lady Vesper replied, her fan moving thoughtfully as she watched the couple navigate the complex patterns of the waltz. "Though I confess I find myself wondering what thoughts occupy their minds as they move through such intimate steps while maintaining such carefully proper expressions." The music swelled to its conclusion, and the couples bowed and curtsied to each other with the formal courtesy required by the dance. Lady Vesper watched as the Marquis escorted Lady Evangeline back to her place among the other matrons, their brief touch of hands as he released her arm lasting perhaps a moment longer than strict propriety demanded. As the evening entered its final phase, with midnight approaching and the last set of dances being announced, Lady Vesper moved with casual purpose toward the raised platform where the orchestra had been performing. The musicians were taking a brief interval, allowing her to approach the bandstand without drawing undue attention to her intentions. "Gentlemen," she addressed the orchestra leader, a distinguished man whose reputation for musical excellence was matched by his discretion in matters of social protocol. "I wonder if I might prevail upon you to assist me in making a brief announcement to our fellow guests. I have received a letter of the most interesting nature, and I believe its contents would prove entertaining to our assembled company." The orchestra leader, recognizing both Lady Vesper's social prominence and the inherent drama of such a request, nodded his agreement and signaled for the attention of the ballroom. The gentle tapping of his baton against a music stand created a crystalline sound that carried clearly across the marble floor, gradually drawing the attention of the 300 guests gathered under the sparkling chandeliers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lady Vesper began, her voice carrying the melodious quality that had made her such a celebrated hostess, "I hope you will indulge me in sharing a document that has recently come to my attention. It speaks so eloquently of the passions that move the human heart, and I believe it will provide a fitting conclusion to this evening of beauty and celebration." The assembled company turned toward the platform with the mixture of curiosity and anticipation that such moments invariably generated. In the sudden hush that fell over the ballroom, the only sounds were the gentle rustling of silk gowns and the soft hiss of candle flames consuming their wax. Lady Vesper withdrew the letter from her reticule with the theatrical timing of a master performer, allowing the candlelight to illuminate the fine paper and elegant handwriting. Across the ballroom, she could see Lady Evangeline's face draining of color as recognition dawned, while the Marquis of Thornfield stood frozen in place as if turned to marble by some ancient curse. "My dearest Adrian," Lady Vesper began, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, each word falling like a crystal drop into the stillness of the moment. The words seemed to hang in the perfumed air of the ballroom like smoke from a discharged pistol, their meaning penetrating the consciousness of the assembled guests with the slow, inexorable precision of a blade finding its mark. Lady Vesper's voice, trained in the arts of projection and dramatic timing, carried every syllable to the furthest corners of the magnificent space, ensuring that not a single member of London's most distinguished society would miss the devastating import of what was being revealed. "My dearest Adrian," she repeated, allowing the intimate salutation to resonate fully before continuing. "The hours we spent in the rose garden yesterday have haunted my thoughts through the endless night. When you took my hand and spoke of the love that dare not be acknowledged, I felt my heart break and soar simultaneously. A collective intake of breath swept through the ballroom like wind moving through a wheat field, followed by a silence so profound that the flickering of candle flames became audible. Lady Evangeline stood transfixed in the center of the room, her face now completely drained of color, the sapphires at her throat catching the light like drops of midnight tears. Her fan had fallen from nerveless fingers to lie forgotten on the polished floor, its delicate ivory sticks splayed like the bones of some small, broken creature. The Marquis of Thornfield had gone equally pale, his usual composed bearing replaced by the rigid posture of a man facing execution. His hands, normally steady and graceful, trembled slightly as he gripped the back of a nearby chair for support. The formal black of his evening wear made him appear almost spectral in the candlelight, a ghost materialized from the shadows of scandal and disgrace. Lady Vesper continued with the relentless precision of an executioner, her voice maintaining its melodious quality even as it delivered words that would destroy reputations built over decades. How cruel that fate should bring us together only to decree that we must remain apart, bound by chains of duty and propriety that grow heavier with each passing day. Yet in those stolen moments when your lips found mine among the climbing roses, I felt more alive than in all the years of my marriage combined. The revelation of actual physical intimacy caused several ladies to reach for their smelling salts, while gentlemen exchanged glances that spoke of social earthquakes and political ramifications that would ripple through the highest levels of British society. The Duchess of Winterbourne, her face a mask of horrified fascination, gripped her husband's arm with sufficient force to leave marks on his sleeve. Lady Lucinda, the young marchioness whose innocence was being shattered with each passing word, stared at her husband with an expression of such profound bewilderment that several guests found themselves looking away from the naked pain in her eyes. She had sunk onto a nearby settee as if her legs could no longer support her weight, her pink silk gown spreading around her like the petals of a flower crushed beneath a careless foot. Yesterday, when we met in the conservatory while dear Lucinda visited her dressmaker, you spoke of your desire to abandon everything for my sake, Lady Vesper continued, her eyes never leaving the letter despite her perfect awareness of the havoc her words were creating throughout the assembled company. You said that duty had become a prison and marriage a living death, that only in my arms did you find the passion that made existence bearable. The Earl of Ravenshollow had emerged from the library, drawn by the unusual silence, and now standing in the doorway like a man witnessing the collapse of his entire world. His scholarly countenance, usually marked by the gentle abstraction of a man more comfortable with books than social gatherings, now displayed the terrible clarity of complete understanding. His wife of nearly 30 years, the woman who had borne his children and presided over his household with seemingly perfect virtue, stood revealed as an adulteress of the most scandalous variety. But perhaps, Lady Vesper's voice took on a tone of even greater drama. The most telling portion of this passionate correspondence concerns plans for tonight's festivities. Listen, if you will, to these prophetic words. Tomorrow evening at the Winterbourne Ball, when all of London society is gathered under one roof, I shall wear the sapphire necklace that you admired so greatly. When you see it gleaming at my throat, know that I am thinking only of you, regardless of who may be watching. Every eye in the ballroom turned to Lady Evangeline's throat, where the magnificent sapphire necklace now seemed to burn like blue fire against her pale skin. The stones that had moments before been objects of admiration and envy now appeared as badges of shame, marking her as surely as if she had been branded with a scarlet letter. After the final waltz, Lady Vesper continued, her voice rising with theatrical emphasis, I shall retire to the blue salon on the 3rd floor. If your heart calls to mine as strongly as mine calls to yours, you will find a way to join me there. Consequences be damned. The final phrase fell into the silence like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and horror throughout the assembled company. Several elderly ladies had already begun to fan themselves vigorously, while others had simply closed their eyes as if to shut out the devastating reality of what they were witnessing. Lady Vesper lowered the letter with the satisfied air of an actress who had just delivered a particularly challenging soliloquy to thunderous applause. The silence that followed was not the appreciative quiet that followed great art, however, but the stunned hush that accompanies great catastrophe. The first sound to break the terrible stillness was a sob from Lady Lucinda, a sound so heartbroken and innocent that it seemed to galvanize the frozen tableau into sudden motion. The young woman rose unsteadily from her seat and began to move toward her husband, her hand extended as if seeking some explanation that might restore her shattered world to wholeness. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of silk rustling and candle flames flickering. "Please tell me this is some terrible mistake, some cruel jest that will be revealed as harmless entertainment." The Marquis of Thornfield looked at his wife with eyes that held nothing but guilt and sorrow. His silence more damning than any confession could have been. His inability to meet her gaze, the way his hands trembled as he reached toward her only to fall back to his sides, spoke more eloquently than words of the complete accuracy of Lady Vesper's revelations. Lady Evangeline had found her voice at last, though it emerged as little more than a broken whisper. "Vesper, how could you? How could you expose private words, private moments, to such public scrutiny? Have you no sense of mercy, no understanding of the devastation you have unleashed?" "My dear Evangeline," Lady Vesper replied, her tone now containing notes of mock sympathy that made her words even more cutting, "I am merely the messenger in this affair. The devastation, as you so aptly term it, was created by your own actions, your own choices, your own complete abandonment of the moral principles that are supposed to govern those of our elevated station." The Earl of Ravenshollow had moved through the crowd with the slow, deliberate steps of a man walking to his own funeral. When he reached his wife's side, he looked at her with an expression that combined profound sadness with the kind of disappointment that cuts deeper than anger ever could. "Evangeline," he said quietly, his scholar's voice maintaining its cultivated tones even in this moment of ultimate humiliation, "I believe we should retire from this gathering. Whatever explanations may be offered, whatever apologies might be tendered, this is neither the time nor the place for such conversations." Around them, the cream of London society had begun to fragment into smaller groups, whispered conversations breaking out like small fires throughout the ballroom. The scandal would be dissected, analyzed, and discussed in drawing rooms throughout Mayfair for months to come, with each telling adding new details and embellishments until the truth became buried beneath layers of speculation and gossip. Several couples had already begun to make their excuses to their hosts, claiming sudden indispositions or pressing engagements that required their immediate departure. The Winterbourne Ball, which had been intended as the social triumph of the season, was rapidly transforming into the most notorious gathering in recent memory. Young Lord Pemberton, who had been dancing with Lady Lucinda earlier in the evening, stepped forward with the chivalrous instincts of his upbringing. "Lady Thornfield," he said gently, offering her his arm, "perhaps you would allow me to escort you to your carriage? The evening air might prove beneficial to your constitution." Lady Lucinda looked at him with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the space of minutes, the innocence that had characterized her demeanor throughout the evening now replaced by the hollow knowledge that comes with the complete destruction of trust. She nodded mutely and allowed herself to be led from the ballroom, leaving behind her husband and mother to face the consequences of their actions without the burden of her wounded presence. The Marquis of Thornfield stood alone in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by hundreds of his social peers yet isolated by scandal as effectively as if he had been marooned on a desert island. His evening clothes, so perfectly tailored and elegant, now seemed like costume worn by an actor who had forgotten his lines, leaving him exposed and ridiculous before a hostile audience. Lady Vesper carefully folded the letter and returned it to her reticule, her mission accomplished with a thoroughness that exceeded even her own expectations. The letter had served its purpose, transforming a pleasant social gathering into a spectacle of moral destruction that would be remembered and discussed for decades to come. As she prepared to make her own strategic withdrawal from the scene of carnage she had created, Lady Vesper caught sight of her reflection in one of the many mirrors that lined the ballroom walls. The image showed a woman of striking beauty and elegant bearing, her diamonds glittering like stars against the midnight blue of her gown. Yet there was something in her eyes, a cold satisfaction that spoke of appetites fed and hungers temporarily satisfied, that transformed her from beauty into something far more dangerous. The orchestra, uncertain how to proceed in the face of such unprecedented social chaos, had begun to pack away their instruments with the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood that their services would no longer be required. The music that had provided such elegant accompaniment to the evening's dancing would be replaced by the discordant symphony of whispered gossip and shocked speculation. The morning after the Winterbourne ball dawned grey and drizzling, as if the very heavens wept for the destruction that had been wrought in the crystal chandeliered ballroom the previous evening. Throughout the fashionable districts of London, behind the elegant facades of Georgian townhouses and grand mansions, the most exclusive members of society were awakening to a world fundamentally altered by the revelations that had shattered the careful pretenses of respectability. Lady Vesper rose at her customary hour of 9, despite having retired well past 2 in the morning. Her lady's maid had already prepared her morning chocolate and arranged the day's correspondence on a silver tray, but the usual collection of social invitations and calling cards had been replaced by an extraordinary assortment of messages that spoke to the seismic impact of the previous evening's entertainment. "My lady," Margaret ventured as she assisted with the intricate process of morning toilette, "there have been rather more callers than usual. Mrs. Hartwell reports that the bell has been ringing constantly since 8 o'clock, with ladies arriving in carriages bearing some of the finest crests in London." Lady Vesper smiled as she surveyed her reflection in the dressing-table mirror, noting with satisfaction that her complexion showed no signs of the late evening or the dramatic exertions of the previous night. Her auburn hair had been arranged in a simple but elegant style suitable for morning visitors, while her gown of deep green silk struck exactly the right note of respectability tinged with subtle drama. "I suspect, my dear Margaret, that today will prove to be one of the most entertaining in recent memory. Please inform Mrs. Hartwell that I will receive visitors in the blue drawing-room beginning at 10:30, but that I can accommodate no more than 6 ladies at any given time. The nature of this morning's conversations will require a more intimate setting than our usual gatherings." The first delegation to be admitted consisted of Lady Pemberton, Lady Ashworth, and the Duchess of Marlborough, 3 women whose combined social influence could make or destroy reputations with the efficiency of a well-orchestrated military campaign. They entered the drawing-room with expressions that combined fascination, horror, and barely concealed excitement at finding themselves at the epicenter of the season's most explosive scandal. "My dear Vesper," began the Duchess, her voice pitched to carry the appropriate weight of moral authority, "we have come to discuss the extraordinary events of last evening. The entire fabric of our social order seems to have been torn asunder by your revelations, and we feel some responsibility to address the implications for our community as a whole." Lady Vesper poured tea with the same graceful precision she had demonstrated the previous morning, though the china service she had chosen for this occasion was her finest Sèvres porcelain, decorated with scenes of pastoral innocence that provided ironic commentary on the subject at hand. "Your Grace, I am naturally at your disposal for any discussion you deem necessary, though I confess myself somewhat puzzled by your reference to my revelations. I was merely the unfortunate recipient of correspondence that I felt duty-bound to share with our assembled friends." "Duty-bound?" Lady Ashworth's eyebrows rose with theatrical precision. "My dear lady, there are those who might question whether public humiliation serves the cause of duty better than private counseling and discreet intervention." "Perhaps," Lady Vesper replied, her voice maintaining its honeyed tones while her eyes hardened with something that might have been steel, "but private counseling assumes that the parties involved possess sufficient moral sense to recognize their transgressions and modify their behavior accordingly." The contents of that letter suggested a level of abandoned passion that had moved far beyond the reach of gentle guidance. Meanwhile, in the Ravens Hollow mansion on Portman Square, a very different sort of reckoning was taking place behind closed doors. The Earl had requested that his wife join him in his private study immediately after breakfast, a summons that carried the weight of formal judgment despite its domestic setting. Lady Evangeline entered the book-lined sanctuary where her husband spent most of his waking hours with the bearing of a condemned prisoner approaching the scaffold. She had chosen her clothing with careful attention to propriety, a morning dress of dove-grey merino wool, unadorned except for jet buttons that seemed to anticipate the mourning she would soon be required to wear for her social death. The Earl stood with his back to the room, gazing out through tall windows at the garden where his wife had apparently conducted some of her clandestine meetings with their son-in-law. His shoulders, usually held with the unconscious authority of his position, seemed to have acquired a permanent stoop overnight, as if the weight of betrayal had physically altered his frame. 30 years, Evangeline," he said without turning to face her, his voice carrying the measured cadences that had served him so well in academic debates but now seemed inadequate to encompass the magnitude of personal devastation. 30 years of marriage, of shared responsibilities, of public appearances together. 30 years during which I believed myself to be living with a woman of unimpeachable virtue and honor. Charles, Lady Evangeline began, her voice breaking slightly on his name. I know that no explanation can excuse what has occurred, no apology can restore what has been lost. But I must at least attempt to help you understand how such a situation could have developed. Understanding, the Earl repeated, finally turning to face his wife but maintaining the physical distance that now seemed to stretch like an unbridgeable chasm between them. Yes, I confess myself eager for understanding. Help me comprehend how a woman who bore my children, who presided over my household, who accompanied me to court functions and charity events, could simultaneously be conducting an affair with our daughter's husband. The brutal directness of his words, delivered in the same tone he might have used to discuss a particularly challenging passage of Latin poetry, seemed to strike Lady Evangeline with physical force. She sank into one of the leather armchairs that flanked the fireplace, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack under the pressure of complete exposure. It began innocently, she whispered, her hands twisted together in her lap like white flowers being slowly crushed. Conversations about literature, shared appreciation for poetry and art. Adrian seemed to understand aspects of my nature that had remained hidden for so many years, thoughts and feelings that I had convinced myself were inappropriate for a woman of my station. And from shared literary discussions, you progressed to assignations in conservatories and rose gardens? The Earl's voice carried a bitter edge that his wife had never heard before, the sound of intellectual precision applied to emotional devastation. From appreciation of poetry to plans for clandestine meetings during public gatherings? In the Thornfield mansion on Grosvenor Square, a parallel scene of confrontation was unfolding with even more dramatic intensity. Lady Lucinda had requested that her husband join her in the morning room, a sun-filled space decorated in shades of yellow and cream that had always been her particular sanctuary within their grand home. She sat beside the tall windows that overlooked their private garden, still wearing the white muslin morning dress she had donned upon rising, her usual morning routine of careful grooming abandoned in favor of immediate confrontation. Her hair hung in loose waves around her shoulders, and her face bore the marks of a sleepless night spent in tears and bewildered anguish. The Marquis entered the room with the reluctant steps of a man walking to his own execution, his usual commanding presence diminished by guilt and the terrible weight of exposure. He had dressed with his customary attention to detail, but the perfection of his appearance only served to emphasize the moral collapse that had been revealed the previous evening. "Lucinda," he began, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence, "I know that anything I might say will seem inadequate in the face of what has been revealed. But I must at least attempt to explain, to help you understand that what occurred was never intended to cause you pain." "Never intended to cause me pain?" Lady Lucinda's voice, usually soft and musical, carried an edge of steel that transformed her from innocent victim into something far more formidable. "You conducted an affair with my own mother, planned assignations under my very nose, wrote passionate letters detailing your desire to abandon our marriage, and you claim this was never intended to cause me pain?" The young woman rose from her chair with fluid grace, moving to stand directly before her husband with her hands clasped behind her back, and her chin raised in a gesture of defiance that would have been impossible for her just 24 hours earlier. "Tell me, Adrian, when you held my mother in your arms in the rose garden, did you spare even a moment's thought for your wife? When you planned to meet her in the blue salon last evening, did you consider what such an act would mean for the woman who has shared your name and your bed for over a year?" Back in Lady Vesper's drawing room, the morning's parade of visitors had continued with clockwork precision, each delegation bringing new perspectives on the scandal and its implications for London society. The current group consisted of younger matrons, women whose own marriages were recent enough that they could view the Ravensholler-Thornfield affair with a combination of horror and morbid fascination. "The truly shocking aspect," declared Lady Fenwick, a woman whose own reputation for virtue was enhanced by her complete lack of imagination regarding passion, "is not merely the adultery itself, but the complete abandonment of generational propriety. A woman of Lady Evangeline's age carrying on with a man young enough to be her son, and that man being her own daughter's husband, represents a level of moral corruption that threatens the very foundations of our social order." "Indeed," agreed Mrs. Harrington, whose recent elevation to the nobility through marriage had made her more zealous than most in defending aristocratic principles. If women of Lady Evangeline's station and supposed respectability can engage in such scandalous behavior, what hope is there for maintaining the moral standards that distinguish us from the lower orders? Lady Vesper listened to these discussions with the satisfied air of a chess master watching opponents fall into carefully prepared traps. Each expression of shock and moral outrage served to reinforce her position as the defender of social virtue, the courageous woman who had risked personal comfort to expose corruption within their ranks. "Ladies," she said during a lull in the conversation, "while I understand and share your concern for our social fabric, I believe we must also consider the larger implications of last evening's revelations. This was not merely a case of personal misconduct, but evidence of a systematic deception that had the potential to corrupt our entire community." As the afternoon progressed, news arrived from various quarters about the immediate consequences of the scandal. Lady Lucinda had departed London for her family's estate in Scotland, accompanied only by her personal maid and a single footman. The Marquis had shut himself in his study and was refusing all visitors, while rumours circulated that he was considering voluntary exile to the family's holdings in Ireland. The Earl of Ravenshollow had issued a formal statement through his solicitors announcing his intention to seek a legal separation from his wife, while Lady Evangeline had been observed leaving London in a closed carriage, destination unknown. The precision with which the scandal had dismantled two of London's most prominent families demonstrated the devastating power of exposed secrets in a society built on carefully maintained appearances. As evening approached and the last of the day's visitors departed, Lady Vesper found herself alone in her drawing-room, surrounded by the detritus of social triumph. Empty teacups, scattered calling cards, and the lingering scent of various perfumes that had accompanied the parade of London's most influential ladies. She moved to the window that overlooked Berkeley Square, watching as lamplighters began their evening rounds, transforming the darkening streets into ribbons of golden light. The sight filled her with a profound sense of satisfaction, the knowledge that she had successfully orchestrated one of the most spectacular social downfalls in recent memory. Yet as she stood there in the gathering dusk, Lady Vesper became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere around her townhouse. The usual bustle of evening social preparations seemed muted. The stream of carriages passing in the square appeared to give her residents a wider berth than usual, and the servants who had been so efficient throughout the day now moved with a kind of nervous precision that suggested underlying anxiety. The realization came to her gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape that had seemed familiar in darkness but revealed unexpected features in the light. While she had succeeded in destroying her targets, she had also transformed herself from social arbiter into social pariah, from the woman everyone wanted to please into the woman everyone feared to cross. 6 months had passed since the infamous Winterbourne Ball, and London society had slowly begun to heal from the wounds inflicted by that evening's revelations, though the scars would remain visible for generations to come. The season had ended with unprecedented drama, and the subsequent months had witnessed a complete reshuffling of social hierarchies as families chose sides, formed new alliances, and adapted to a world where the previously unthinkable had been not only imagined but exposed in devastating detail. Lady Vesper stood once again before the mirror in her dressing chamber, but the woman reflected in the silvered glass bore subtle marks of the isolation that had become her constant companion. Her beauty remained intact, her wardrobe as elegant as ever, yet there was something in her eyes that spoke of victories that had proven hollow, of triumphs that had extracted unexpected prices from their architect. The morning ritual of receiving callers had become a much diminished affair. Where once her drawing-room had overflowed with London's most influential ladies, eager to share gossip and glean information, now she might receive perhaps 3 or 4 visitors in an entire day, and those usually women whose own social standing had been damaged by association with various scandals. "My lady," Margaret announced as she arranged the morning's correspondence, "Lady Pemberton has sent her regrets for this afternoon's appointment. She cites a sudden indisposition, though her note arrived with suspicious promptness." Lady Vesper accepted the news with the philosophical resignation that had become her characteristic response to such social snubs. She had learned, through painful experience, that society's memory for sensation was matched only by its capacity for self-protection. Those who had hung on her every word during the aftermath of the ball now treated her with the wary respect accorded to dangerous predators, impressive in their power, but too hazardous for comfortable association. The fate of her principal victims had varied considerably in the months following their public disgrace. Lady Evangeline had indeed withdrawn to a remote estate in Wales, where she lived in virtual exile under an assumed name, her days occupied with charitable work among the local poor. Reports from those few who had encountered her described a woman transformed by suffering into something approaching genuine humility, her former pride replaced by quiet dedication to causes that required nothing of her former social connections. The Earl of Ravenshollow had pursued his threatened legal separation with a methodical precision that characterized all his endeavors. The proceedings had been conducted with discretion, but the outcome was inevitable. Lady Evangeline was stripped of her title, her access to family funds severely restricted, and her social existence effectively terminated. The Earl himself had retreated into his scholarly pursuits with renewed intensity, as if ancient texts and archaeological discoveries could provide refuge from the betrayals of contemporary life. The Marquis of Thornfield had chosen a more dramatic form of exile, accepting a diplomatic posting to the distant corners of the British Empire where his social disgrace would be unknown and his administrative talents could serve the Crown's interests without compromising London society's carefully maintained equilibrium. His departure had been quietly arranged through family connections, allowing him to disappear from public view without the additional scandal of a trial or formal censure. Lady Lucinda had surprised everyone, including her own family, by refusing to retreat into permanent seclusion. After spending several months at her Scottish estate, she had returned to London with a transformed presence that combined her natural sweetness with a newfound strength born of surviving complete betrayal. She had retained her title through the legal complexities of separated marriage, and her dignity in the face of public humiliation had actually enhanced her social standing among those who valued character over mere respectability. On this particular autumn morning, as golden light filtered through the tall windows of her Berkeley Square drawing-room, Lady Vesper was surprised to receive a calling card that bore a familiar name. Lady Lucinda, Marchioness of Thornfield. The young woman she had helped to devastate 6 months earlier was requesting an audience, a development that filled Lady Vesper with a complex mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and something that might have been hope. Lady Lucinda entered the drawing-room with the poised bearing of a woman who had passed through fire, and emerged refined rather than consumed. She wore a walking dress of deep blue wool, simply cut but expertly tailored, with a bonnet that framed her face in a way that emphasized the maturity that suffering had brought to her features. Her manner was courteous but contained, suggesting a purpose that transcended mere social convention. "Lady Vesper," she said as she accepted the offered seat and declined refreshment with a graceful gesture, "I hope you will forgive the presumption of this unannounced visit. I have been meaning to call upon you for some weeks, but only recently found the courage to act upon my intentions." "My dear Lady Lucinda," Lady Vesper replied, her voice carrying genuine warmth for the first time in months, "you require no apology for honoring my home with your presence. Indeed, I confess myself both surprised and pleased by your visit, though I cannot imagine what business you might wish to discuss with someone who played such a destructive role in your personal affairs." Lady Lucinda studied her hostess with eyes that seemed to perceive depths invisible to casual observation. When she spoke, her voice carried the measured cadences of someone who had spent considerable time in contemplation of complex moral questions. "I have come," she said quietly, "to thank you." The words fell into the silence of the drawing-room like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of confusion and astonishment that seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the elegantly appointed space. Lady Vesper set down her teacup with hands that trembled slightly, her usual composure shaken by a response she could never have anticipated. "Thank me," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "My dear child, I fear the events of recent months may have affected your judgment more severely than anyone realized. I was the instrument of your public humiliation, the cause of your marriage's destruction, the agent of your family's disgrace. How could such actions possibly merit gratitude?" Lady Lucinda leaned forward slightly, her expression combining sympathy with a kind of gentle firmness that transformed her from victim into teacher. "Because, Lady Vesper, you freed me from a life built upon lies. You revealed truths that I might never have discovered through any other means, and in doing so, you gave me the opportunity to choose my own path rather than continuing to live within the confines of others' deceptions." She paused, gathering her thoughts like a musician preparing to perform a particularly challenging passage. For over a year, I lived as the wife of a man whose heart belonged elsewhere, believing myself cherished when I was merely tolerated. I presided over a household where my own mother conducted clandestine affairs, trusting in family bonds that were corrupted by betrayal. You stripped away those comfortable illusions and forced me to confront reality, however painful that confrontation might have been. Lady Vesper felt something shifting within her chest, a sensation like ice beginning to crack under the pressure of warming temperatures. The carefully constructed justifications she had built around her actions, the moral superiority she had claimed as defender of social virtue, seemed suddenly fragile in the face of this unexpected absolution. But the pain you suffered, Lady Vesper protested, her voice carrying notes of genuine distress. The public humiliation, the destruction of your marriage, the scandal that will follow your family name for generations. How can you regard such devastation as a kindness? Because, Lady Lucinda replied with a smile that carried both sadness and surprising warmth, pain that leads to truth is preferable to comfort built upon deception. The humiliation you speak of lasted mere weeks, but the freedom you gave me will endure for the rest of my life. I am no longer trapped in a marriage without love, no longer blind to the true nature of those closest to me, no longer living a lie that would have consumed my entire existence. As the afternoon progressed, the two women engaged in a conversation that ranged across topics of morality, justice, and redemption with a depth that neither had experienced in months of superficial social interactions. Lady Lucinda spoke of her plans to establish a charitable foundation focused on assisting women who found themselves abandoned by family or fortune, while Lady Vesper found herself discussing her own growing sense of isolation and the unexpected consequences of her social victory. I confess, Lady Vesper admitted as the golden light of late afternoon slanted through the drawing-room windows, that I had not anticipated how completely my actions would alter my own position within society. I thought myself the instrument of justice, the defender of moral order, but I find that society fears its defenders almost as much as it despises its transgressors. Lady Lucinda nodded with the understanding of someone who had learned similar lessons through different means. Society values stability above justice, comfort above truth. When you exposed the contradictions within our social fabric, you reminded everyone of their own vulnerabilities, their own potential for scandal. They cannot condemn you without acknowledging their complicity, yet they cannot embrace you without accepting their own moral compromises. As their conversation drew toward its conclusion, Lady Lucinda rose to take her leave with the same graceful composure that had marked her arrival. At the drawing-room door, she paused and turned back to her hostess with an expression that combined warmth with subtle invitation. Lady Vesper, I hope you will consider attending the charity gala I am organizing for next month. It will be a much smaller gathering than the grand balls of previous seasons, but I believe you would find the company more genuinely welcoming than the audiences you have grown accustomed to entertaining. After Lady Lucinda's departure, Lady Vesper found herself alone with thoughts and emotions that she had spent months attempting to suppress. The young woman's unexpected gratitude had illuminated aspects of her own motivations that she had preferred to keep hidden, even from herself. The letter she had read at the Winterbourne ball had indeed served justice, but it had also served her own darker impulses toward drama and control. As evening settled over Berkeley Square, Lady Vesper made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Moving to her escritoire, she withdrew paper of the finest quality and began to compose letters of her own, not instruments of destruction this time, but tentative overtures toward reconciliation and redemption. The first letter was addressed to Lady Evangeline in her Welsh exile, offering not apology for actions that had been justified, but acknowledgement of the human cost of even righteous justice. The second went to the Earl of Ravenshollow, expressing respect for his dignity in the face of betrayal and suggesting that perhaps there were ways for former adversaries to coexist with mutual understanding if not friendship. The final letter, the most difficult to write, was addressed to the Marquis of Thornfield in his distant diplomatic posting. In it, Lady Vesper attempted to acknowledge the complexity of human emotion while maintaining the moral standards that had driven her actions. She wrote of the possibility that justice and compassion might find ways to coexist, that even those who had transgressed societal boundaries might find paths toward redemption. As she sealed the letters with wax that caught the candlelight like drops of molten gold, Lady Vesper felt something she had not experienced since the night of the Winterbourne ball, the possibility of genuine peace. She had learned that power over others was nothing compared to mastery over oneself, that destroying reputations was easier than building understanding, and that the most profound victories were those that created rather than demolished. The autumn wind rattled the windows of her Berkeley Square townhouse as if seeking entrance to the warmth within, but Lady Vesper no longer felt the chill of isolation that had surrounded her for so many months. She had discovered, through the unexpected grace of her victim's forgiveness, that redemption was possible even for those who dealt in the currency of scandal and revelation. In the months that followed, London society would witness an unprecedented transformation as former enemies found ways to coexist, as moral complexity replaced simple judgment, and as the rigid hierarchies that had governed their world slowly evolved to accommodate deeper truths about human nature and the price of genuine virtue. The letter that had begun this tale of passion and punishment would become, in time, not merely an instrument of destruction but a catalyst for growth, understanding, and ultimately, a more honest form of social grace. Lady Vesper had learned that the greatest gossip was not that which destroyed, but that which illuminated, not that which divided, but that which ultimately served the cause of truth and human connection. As the candles burned low in their silver holders and the clock on the mantelpiece chimed the late hour, Lady Vesper closed her eyes and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had discovered that redemption, like scandal, could arrive when least expected and transform even the most carefully constructed social edifices into something more beautiful, more honest, and ultimately more worthy of the human hearts that beat within them.